Erica, thanks so much for being on the podcast. Really excited to have you on as someone who's really well versed in philosophy, but also kind of a practical focus on it around decision making. And I know you do some coaching and you have some courses to help entrepreneurs and businesses. So a lot that I'm sure we can get into. But I guess let me start by just asking the decision making process. I think it's something you think a lot about. I do as well. And it's something that seems to be very difficult for us and a really big challenge. So I'm curious just to kind of get your initial take of what you think makes making decisions such a hard thing for us.
Okay, thank you, Terry. Thanks for having me. And you dive straight into it, to the main bone of the matter. Well, why it's so difficult for us to make good decisions? That's a very good question. I'm actually writing a full book about it. So a short answer is not possible, but I think fear is one thing. Fear of failing, fear of making the wrong decision, fear of losing social approval. That's one big thing on the psychological level.
If I could ask on that, Erica, just so I get that totally. I think fear is the root of a lot of things that go bad in our lives and bad things in general. But I guess as you kind of unpack that a little bit, you could see somebody saying, well, fear is functional, right? Fear helps us make better decisions because we want to get to the right outcome. We want to get to the right answer. And that keeps us sharp. That keeps us focused, maybe. It doesn't seem like that's the case, but just curious, how does fear actually translate into that bad decision versus being functional?
Yeah, you got the point, because we do want to make a risk analysis when we make a decision, so that we don't make a rash decision that where we don't take into account possible risks and possible costs that we don't want to arrive at. But the problem is that many people take this too far. And we do have one of our unconscious biases that are deeply rooted in our primitive brain is the risk aversion, which makes us more prone to avoid a risk than to gain a benefit. If I were to offer you $800 straight away, cash in hand, or you could wait for a month and I'll give you $1,000. I mean, there's always the risk that after a month I won't be there. I won't stick around to give it to you. So most people in research, they choose the $800 cash in hand, and that's one of the things where you would want to conquer your fear, because it would be better to get $1,000 in a month's time. Yeah,
so it leads to ultimately, I guess, irrational decisions. And I like the way you explain it, because I think of many things in mathematical terms, not necessarily literally, but I think the way you do as well, and some of the work that I've read of yours of, it's evaluation. We're trying to evaluate the pros and cons, the costs, the benefits, and come out ultimately to the right kind of mathematically net positive answer, if you will. And I guess what you're saying is that risk aversion, it stops us from being able to run that calculation accurately, right? We can't be as objective in it as we'd want to be when we run it. Is that kind of the point?
Yeah, that's it. And the same thing, there are a lot of examples about the thing with sunk costs. You're familiar with that?
Yeah,
that concept. I mean, if I bought, that's also a totally irrational thing, but it's the fear of missing out. It's the fear of wasting money, though it's already wasted and I cannot get it back. Say, for instance, do you want me to explain it for maybe your listeners? Not everyone is familiar with it.
Sure.
Say that I've been given I bought a concert ticket for a Saturday evening, and it cost me £200. It's a lot of money. And then Saturday comes, and I'm not really up to going. I feel I have a flu coming on, and I'd rather just stay at home in front of the fire and have a glass of wine or a cup of tea, whatever.
That's nice.
But then I feel, but I've paid this money. I paid £200 for it. I cannot waste that money. I have to go to the concert. So I drag myself out to the concert, out in the rain. My flu gets worse, and I don't enjoy it. But I got my money's worth, didn't I? And that's also one of the ways that our unconscious biases tricks us, because I didn't get my money's worth, did I? I was miserable. I would have been better at home. And the money I spent, the £200, pounds were already spent. They were a sunk cost. I wouldn't get it back, no matter if I went to the concert or if I stayed at home. But that's where we trick ourselves. Yeah. And especially in, say, in business, if you're invested in something, it's very difficult for us to make the decision to get out of that project because it's not working for us and start something new because we've already invested so much money, time, energy. But if these investments, the costs, if they are sunk, if we cannot get them back, we shouldn't take that into account when we make the decision. That's not a factor that should be taken into account. Rather, what do we lose by continuing in that project?
Yeah, that makes so much sense. So much so that I often wonder, and I think for people listening, this will resonate for them. I think conceptually, a lot of people will hear that, or those that are aware of it and say, yes, I get that. That makes sense. I should do that. But you used the term before about, our mind, our subconscious, unconscious mind tricking us. And I think that's really interesting because I think that's where I think the puzzle really is that so many people would hear this and say, yeah, get it. That makes sense. I won't do that. But then in the moment, when it actually happens for them individually, they can't seem to remember it, or they can't seem to keep that logic in place. Why do you think that's so hard for people that they can conceptualize it, but they can't execute it?
Because it's so deeply ingrained in our habits. And habits, that's something you do, a routine, a habit, something you do without thinking about it. And if you want to change some of those things, some of your unconscious biases, you cannot get rid of them because they're so deeply ingrained. But what you can do is to make yourself more conscious about it. The same way as if you were to change another very deeply rooted habit in your life that you do without thinking about it. And an interesting fact is that, I don't remember the figures, the actual numbers, but they did a research study on corporations that had a process in place to mitigate the unconscious biases in their decision-making process. You have a point where you have to ask yourself the question, am I influenced by this, or that different bias? And you'll always go through that questioning. And the businesses that incorporated such a practice, they had a much higher revenue than those who did nothing. That were only, as you say, they were conscious about, okay, yes, there are things such as like unconscious biases, and of course we shouldn't fall for them, but they had nothing implemented in their decision-making process that made them actually take it into account. And that did show up in their numbers, in their revenue.
That's really interesting. Would you go as far to say that we can't trust, I'll be provocative, I guess, that we can't trust our own minds, that because of these unconscious biases, and by definition, right, they're unconscious, they're a blind spot that we really can't be aware of, so we really don't have clarity on what they are or where they exist, is kind of the general rule to say, don't trust your mind. You need to get some external validation or some sort of objective view on it?
I wouldn't go that far, but I would go as far as saying that in any decision, that is of any kind of importance to you, you would need to involve not only your gut feeling, because that can lead you astray, but it can also lead you very right. But also involve your rational thinking and do some, as you say, some objective calculations or weighing of the alternatives. So I propose a holistic view. But neither should you only go for a rational decision-making method, just calculating things and go for what the logic tells you to do, because I'm not taking into account your values, because your intuition, I think, some people think intuition is something magic. That's not the view I have. Intuition is my subconscious pattern recognition system in the brain that recognizes whole patterns, whereas my rational mind can only recognize bits and pieces, details. It's very good at that, but it cannot take the whole pattern in. So utilizing both of these, both your intuition and your rational mind in together, and being aware of your tendency towards some unconscious biases, and being aware of your social surrounding and your tendency to maybe be unduly influenced by some people, or the social and psychological aspects. So decision making is really a very complex matter, according to me.
No, sorry. I agree with you totally. And what I love about that is, oftentimes today and for a while probably, much of the advice people get about how do you make better decisions, people that are trying to provide that help want to make it seem simple, partially because they want to sell their product or whatever it is, but also partially because I think our minds just strive for simplicity. And what I love about what you're saying is that you're kind of owning and just acknowledging the fact that it's not simple. It's going to be hard. It's complex. There's lots of different factors, and there's no magic fix to this. And furthermore, there's no guarantee that even if you do it this right way, that you're going to get to the right outcome. It's messy, it's nuanced, it's complex, and the best we can do is just try and up our odds of getting to a better outcome, right? Which I think is really important.
That's true. That's true. And also, I haven't got it. If you only make decisions because in my experience, people tend to be either, I go on my intuition, I go on my gut feeling, I do muscle testing, and that's all they do, or they say, I can't trust my emotions, I can't trust my instincts. That's totally unreliable. And that, by the way, is the historical view of why women weren't allowed into politics or things like that, because women were seen to be emotional and swayed by their emotions. So anyway, but the people who take that stance, they refuse to take their emotions as anything valid in their decision making. But that as well as only relying on your decision, on your intuition, could be dangerous. Could lead you totally astray. Only relying on your rational mind can lead you straight too. Could make you make decisions that prioritize money over relations, that prioritize growth of your business over environmental issue, whatever. So,
well, a lot of what you're saying too, you mentioned it before, I think it starts with what you value, right? Because if you think of it in this mathematical type cost benefit, trying to figure out what the right decision is, there has to be some underlying value system that allows you to evaluate and say. And I find that topic fascinating because understanding what we value, what really matters to us. I guess I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, of how somebody can kind of identify what they truly value, what truly matters to them.
That is, I totally agree with you. That's at the foundation of all decision making. Without it, it would be like driving around in a car and without a map, without a clear destination, but still at each road crossing have to decide the right road to get us there, but you don't know where there is.
No
but
idea,
you still have all this decision, and I'm afraid that people do work like that. You make all these decisions, but you're not really clear on the direction in life where you want to go, and that's no easy fix either. Take some deep reflection. What's more important to me? Is it family? Is it human rights? Is it fair treatment of people, any people? Is it, what are you passionate about?
And is that the gauge, do you think? Because I think of it in terms of that subconscious or unconscious mind too. And what I often wonder is, how can we be sure if what we think we value is actually what we value? Which is kind of a weird question to ask, but we're so easily influenced by external things and different factors that we could think we value something, but we don't. And then that leads us down the wrong path. So getting to that kind of true, authentic view of, for us individually, me as an individual, this is what's really important and what matters. I would imagine that's hard for a lot of people and can be a difficult process to navigate, like decision making.
Yeah, I think so too. It's not something that you can just go through a personality test and then everything. But of course there are things like that to use. You can do different kinds of tests, and in my program I give my students a list of hundreds of value words, and you get to work with them and specifically circle them, and you boil it down, and And in different ways like that, you can get sort of a hold on your core values. But then, of course, it's down to reflection. And I would say also a kind of getting older, not specifically in years, but getting older and wiser, if I could say like that, to discover where you are, as you say, influenced by, family upbringing, culture, things like that. And as you say, I don't think we can ever, doubting yourself is fine, but we needn't go as far as Descartes to doubt our existence and to doubt our values altogether. Sometimes, at some stage, I have to stand for my values, even if I'm not quite sure that they are totally mine. I have to make at least a provisional stance that this is my values, and also say that this is always a work in progress. As I live on, I revalue and reassess what's important to me from what new input I get.
Yeah. Do you think, because I have a hypothesis that I play around with sometimes, that when talking about values, if you trace it all the way back to kind of the root or the true foundation of it, from almost a biological or evolutionary perspective, the root values are always trying to survive and ultimately procreate, I guess, and grow our species. Because from a very kind of animalistic biological perspective, that's what everything is kind of built off of. What do you think about that? Do you think that's true, that ultimately we're that simple? Like, obviously it's gotten much more complicated in how it plays out in the later layers of how we try and feed those values, but at the root, it's really just about that. What you talked about in the beginning, that fear of making a bad decision, it all comes back to, well, I want to make sure I survive and I stay alive and I can provide for my family and I can find a mate who's going to allow me to procreate. Do you think that's really what our values come down to at the end of the day?
At the root, that's where they stem from. Yes, the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, that's basically what we are driven by. And then that's biologically and physiologically what we're driven by. But then, of course, culture has added layers to this, that my survival is not only my personal biological survival, but it's the survival of a culture, it's the survival of a people, where I can have a value that is worthwhile to sacrifice my own life for something higher, for a higher good. So it's the same principle of survival, of pleasure. But pleasure we also have different versions of what pleasure is. Say all the religions that have developed over time that place pleasure in a second, sort of after death, a second life. That's one way that culture has imposed a secondary meaning of pleasure, and that would be worthwhile to sacrifice a lot of things to attain that kind of pleasure. But it's the same principle. I agree.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I think you're right. It's an interesting point about it ultimately is all rooted in pleasure, and that's a loaded term. What does pleasure mean, to your point? But I guess it gets back to the values, and that's where it gets interesting, because it becomes a little bit circular. You value what brings you pleasure, but what brings you pleasure is what you value, and it becomes very complicated to kind of distinguish those two, I find sometimes in thinking about that, because part of it feels base, like hedonistic, like, well, just what brings you pleasure. But values are obviously different than that. You can get pleasure by doing drugs or having alcohol or going out partying or eating food, whatever it might be. And somebody could say, well, I guess that's what I value then, because that's where the pleasure is drawn from. But I think it's a little bit more sophisticated than that. Yeah,
obviously. And that's where we have the culture and
the culture stuff comes in. Yeah.
And when I usually say that you should always be true to what you want deep inside. And I often have to add that does not imply selfishness, being selfish, because what I want deep down is sometimes not only related to my sort of physical fulfillment of pleasure. It will give me more pleasure to see someone else happy, for instance, a person close to me in my family. To make that person happy, to see that smile, will give me enormous pleasure. More so than if I'd, say, eaten the ice cream myself, and if I give it to that person instead. Okay, I don't get the sensations of tasting the ice cream, but I get the sensations of feeling the joy of that person. So it's not as simplistic as only pursuing your physical pleasures.
What do you think about, because you can imagine, you could use an extreme scenario of let's say, Adolf Hitler, but you can obviously go less extreme than that, but of people that go through a similar process in their minds and they think, I figured out what I value. I've run the calculations. I believe this is going to help not only me, but this is going to help the world, right? And again, let's take this extreme example of Hitler, who was obviously, in a horrifying way, but has this belief of, I've gone through this process and now I'm acting upon it and I'm doing the right thing. How do you reconcile that? How do you account for that? Because I think there's a lot of people who could think, well, I'm doing what you're saying. I'm being true to my values and I'm acting upon that. What are they missing there? What's missed? What's the step in the process that's not being taken?
I'd say they've missed taking into account the information available to them, what is universally accepted as being true. And I mean, we could go this route down, and end up in either a God or Platonism or something that gives us the objective values, that what is good and what is wrong. We don't need to go all that way down. We could stay at the human level and agree that there are certain things that we almost all of us seem to agree. It's not a good thing to inflict pain on another human being, for instance. Most of us would say that's true. It's not a good thing. And
can I ask about that, Erica? Because I think this is really interesting, because I agree with you, obviously. But I like to kind of test the fringes of it. So take medicine that you need, right? Let's say you need a shot. So I have a child. I have a 7-year-old son. He has his yearly checkup coming up, and he's going to need to get certain shots and vaccines. I am going to intentionally inflict pain on him because I believe there's a greater good. Or maybe he comes home from school today and he does something wrong and I punish him. And I'm deliberately, intentionally bringing pain to him because I believe it's functional. It's going to lead to a greater good. Now, again, I agree. Obviously, I'm using a very different example, but back to that, to your point of, we all agree we shouldn't inflict pain. I wonder, because I think to some extent it becomes subjective, right? I think we do agree there is some pain that we should put onto people for the greater good. And I bring it back to the Hitler example, where obviously his was twisted, but he could be looking through that same framework and saying, yeah, this is bad. There's pain here that's going to be causing a lot of people, but for the world, it's going to be much better at the end of it.
Yeah. I mean, obviously he had an argument which he thought was right and correct. And you and me and most of the people would disagree because the pain is just too big.
Yeah.
And the cost is just too, the benefits is just too speculative. Who says that the world would benefit if there were no Jews or handicapped people or bisexuals around? Yeah. That's a very contestable argument. Yeah. So we come back to our rational decision-making function. That I would say that he hasn't taken his full responsibility and taken into account the argument that he's putting forward.
Yeah, what's interesting as you say that, you mentioned God before, and I think we could spend hours talking about that. But in some ways, one of the functions of God, if I try and make it kind of mechanical, is that it does give us some blueprint. It gives us that value system that it says, this is it. Can't be questioned. It's just what it is. On the other end of that spectrum, maybe what you're getting at is it's almost becomes consensus driven. Like, to your point, it's what do most reasonable people believe? And that's fluid over time. But if we go back to the Hitler example, most reasonable people would look at that and say, no, that's wrong. Your calculation's wrong. You're hurting people, and it's not for a greater good. And although there's no true objective way to prove that out, we just have to trust in society as a whole that if this is what we believe, then that becomes the value that we need to live by. Do you think that's a fair argument?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I don't think we should be surprised that most religions have commandments or rules or values that are in alignment with what most people believe is right or wrong. That's
the mechanism.
That's a natural thing, because religion has come out of our history, and it's this way of codifying. I mean, myths and so on are a way of codifying what is generally believed.
So philosophically, are you okay with that philosophically? Because you could go to like the first one that comes to mind is like a Nietzsche, who believed the masses were, I wouldn't say bad necessarily, but inferior, let's say, right? So this idea of saying, well, what's the consensus view? What does most people believe? And that's what we should kind of hang our values on. Philosophically, do you think that's ultimately the right approach, or is there a better approach to that?
Well, I don't believe we should decide on values by what you call a consensus or a democratic vote. But I do believe in the scientific origin from evolution, where we do have the basic values of caring for each other in a group. Otherwise, the individual would not survive either. We have those kind of very basic values, and it's not the same as bringing together 1 million people today and say, let's vote on if we should kill half the world or not. It's not the same thing. It's more like trying to dig out what kind of organisms are we, and what do we need to survive as a species and have a good life.
I like that. It's very pragmatic. It's very pragmatic to say, let's just figure out what works, what actually works to get us to continue to grow as a species and to be successful, or what have you, and go with that.
I think,
first principles.
Yeah, I think so. And then again, I think the existentialists have been a bit misinterpreted. Maybe not Nietzsche's kind of extreme, but it's sometimes you get the caricature of the existentialist that, well, whatever you feel is your subjective desire or is right for you. Well, yeah, that's it. What's right for me is right for me, and what's right for you may be right for you. I think that's a misconception.
Yeah. It gets back to your point before, right, about decision making, how that's a factor, right? You should consider what feels right to you, but that can't be the only factor. Just it can't just be what's right for somebody else is the only factor. It needs to be, you need to do the work. You need to work through all of that and figure it out. Exactly.
But what I do want to stress is as Sartre said, that we're condemned to freedom. You know that quote, and that's kind of a difficult one. How can you be condemned to freedom? That's the paradox. But really, there's no one else. That's the heart of existentialism. There's no one else is going to make your decisions for you. And even if you don't make any decisions, that in itself is a decision to leave it to someone else. So you can't escape, really. You're condemned.
Well, and I think in some ways that's part of the benefit of religion and spirituality is that, you know, I don't say this in a negative way. I think it's very functional, is that it relieves some of that. You feel like, hey, I'm giving this to God. I don't need to bear that responsibility anymore. I'm just going to leave it in their hands or whatever it is. And there's probably something very comforting in that, you know.
Oh, yes. It is. And the more, I mean, you can see that in the world situation, the more uncertainty there is, the more fundamentalistic religious groups grow, of all kinds. It could be Christian or Muslim or whatever. But the fundamentalism is even more narrow. You get to know exactly, these are the rules to follow, and do it.
What's your take? What's your take on that? I mean, it's a question that's been asked many times, and it's a hard question to answer. But do you think people who can kind of narrow things down like that, at the grand scheme of things, are better off, whether it be happier, less discomfort, less pain in their life, versus the person who's doesn't allow that. They swim in the complexity and the nuance of it. They swim in the uncertainty of I'll never know for sure.
Yeah, it might very well be an easier life. It might. But then on the other hand, that's what, if you go back to the situation of women in history again, that's also what you might have said 100 years ago or 200 years ago. In my country, or a woman wouldn't be counted as having her own autonomy. She couldn't vote, she couldn't decide over her own property, things like that. And someone will say, oh, well, that must be an easy life. You don't have to make these difficult decisions about your money, you're supported, you don't have, but it's also a very limited life. And you might, if you want to draw a parallel, you are, if you leave your decisions to already pre-made religious prescriptions, okay, you have fewer decisions to make, but you're also more limited. You have less freedom of choice.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's almost, I think of it as when you net it out, your potential upside is lower, right? It may be true that what actually ends up happening is you have, maybe in individual cases, there's more happiness or easier life, more pleasure in life, but the potential is so much lower, right? The potential is so much higher when you have that freedom to choose, when you're not limited in that way. And I think, at least from where I sit, I'd rather the potential. Even if it doesn't pan out, I'd rather give myself the opportunity, or give everybody the opportunity to reach their maximum potential in that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And which is the same way that they reasoned with slavery.
Right.
Why should we abolish slavery? They have it. They are in such a good position.
They're happy.
They're happy. They don't have any problems. But of course, many freed slaves, they suddenly they had to, find a job. But it was worth it.
Yeah.
It was so much worth it. Freedom.
Yeah. So as we come towards the end here, I'll ask a question around certainty, which we've been kind of touching on a bit, and objective truth. And I'm curious your take on that, because I think, again, back to the root of all this, decision making, determining our values, a lot of it is we're looking for a stake in the ground. We're looking for some certainty on things. Where do you stand on that? Do you think certainty is even a real thing? Do you think objective truth is even something that really exists that we can ever find, or it's a myth?
Yeah, I don't think objective truth would imply that there is a non-subjective place where I can go and sort of take a God's eyes view on things, and that begs the question in itself. So in that respect, no, I don't think so. But on the other hand, I don't think neither can I deny the existence of, because whatever is beyond my conceptualizations is beyond my conceptualizations, and as soon as I try to say something about it, I conceptualize it. So I would say that reality, it's kind of pragmatism here too. Reality, I cannot bend reality to my own will. Reality gives me boundaries. It's what do you say? It offers resistance for some things that, if I try to do them. So in that case, yes, there is an objective reality and an objective truth about it, but it's not taking me beyond my conceptualizations of it.
That's really, let me play that back to you, because I think that's really interesting what you're saying. I've never thought of it in that way. So what you're saying, I think, is that there is some objective truth in the world, the universe, whatever it is. We know that because we do have boundaries. There are things that we cannot do, or that push back on us. But at the same time, we likely will never understand them. We'll never be able to conceptualize them. We'll never be able to look at them and say, that's exactly what's happening here. I know for certain this is the reason. But just by the pure fact that there are boundaries in our lives, there are things that push back on us, that kind of proves out that there is some objective reality out there that, again. Yeah.
Well put. Yeah.
It's really interesting. It's a really nice way to kind of marry the two concepts. Whereas most people look at it and say, well, you're in one camp or the other. That's a way to say, no, actually both can be true in some ways. It's true that we can't ever know it, but it's still there.
Yeah, it's kind of related, derived from, Hilary Putnam, internal realism.
I don't think
no, okay. I've derived a position of my own I call pragmatic realism, which is this, trying to steer between these two. It's not anti-realism, it's not realism, but it's pragmatic realism.
Really interesting. So how do you, I guess, bringing it back here towards the end, as the work you do, I know you're a teacher, but also a coach and do many different things. These philosophical conversations, all these things we've been saying, how do you try and bring them into real life when you're working with a client or when you're teaching a course? What's the practical way for somebody listening to say, okay, I love this conversation. I love thinking about these big philosophical topics. It helps me to gain some clarity on my thinking, but what do I do today or tomorrow to help utilize these things to my benefit?
Okay, well, there's so many things to do. I do have a website. I do have a 6-week online program on decision making. And on the website, I have a couple of free PDFs. One is called 2 Steps That Will Instantly Make You a Better Decision Maker. So there is all the range from, just popping into my website and read a blog post to take my full 6-week program on decision making, which will give you this decision process, holistic one. So I could give you my website URL if you want to.
Yeah, if people are interested, definitely. Yeah, and I could post that when I post the show for sure. If people want to hear more about it, Yeah.
And there's also books. Of course, as a philosopher of religion, I published about this pragmatic realism and articles and things like that. And now I'm also writing a couple of more popular books, not the academic books, about decision making, because as you say, philosophy of real life, that's really why I've also taken time off my university job to start my own business, to be able to do more of less academic. How many angels can dance on a tip of a needle? That's not all we do, of course not.
Sure.
But I want to help people with more practical, down to earth, real life philosophy as decision making. So that's really what I want. I want to take these concepts about uncertainty, about freedom, about values, and put them into practice in people's lives. Coaches, business owners, with all the daily decisions that we face. So how to go about them, how to count in the uncertainty of life, how to count in my freedom, what to do about it.
That's great.
And I love it. It's great.
Yeah, I can see it on your face that you love it. Yeah. So last question for you, because it's something I think about a lot. And the path you're down is a path that I admire a lot, and one that I may even aspire to at some point. To what we talked about before, about how complex this all is and how nuanced it is and how difficult it is to actually execute. How do you try and balance that now that you've kind of delved into the business side of it and building a business off of it, of the balance between trying to get people to come to you and take your coaching and buy your product and making them feel like there's a compelling value proposition, while at the same time maintaining that honesty with them to say, hey, this may not work for you, or this is going to be really hard, and there's not a quick fix to this, and it's going to be challenging. How do you try and maintain that balance?
Well, it's not a great sales argument. I agree, but that's the reality. That's the truth. And I like to be very honest. And what I do want to emphasize is that decision making is a skill. It's a skill set. It's not a black or white thing. But it's like practicing the piano or learning a second language. There are degrees, and wherever you are at the moment, you can always improve on your decision making skills. And that is what I teach, how to get better. Yeah.
There's no guarantees. There's not a hey, you do this and then it's binary, you become this. It's a progression to get better as you think and develop these skills.
It's a progression. And I do provide the tools, templates for making calculations, the risk analysis and things like that. I do provide the mindset and exercises and reflections, and also the decision-making process that goes through, that makes certain that you don't miss some crucial aspect, that makes sure if you follow this process, decision-making process, you will take into account the risk that you're being tricked by your unconscious bias. You will take into account if the social surroundings are relevant to your decision. So that's one kind of framework that I guarantee that you have. But then, of course, it's a matter of practicing and giving yourself feedback, learning how to tap into your intuition, learning how to use the rational models, and getting better and better.
It's the goal.
It's a lifelong process.
That's it. It's a lifelong journey. That's exactly right. Well, Erica, I've really, really enjoyed this conversation, both philosophically and kind of meta, but also very practically. I think it's going to be really useful for people to hear both sides of that. And I think that's a lot of the value that you're bringing, is that you bring both sides of that. You have both aspects of it. And I think, as we said, for those interested, want to hear more about it, I'll share out the link on the website, on the podcast when I post it. And I would definitely recommend checking out Erica and the work she's doing. So Erica, thanks so much for being a guest today.
Okay, thank you. I enjoyed it very much too, to talk to you, Terry. It's been a joy.
I hope you have a great rest of your day, and good luck with the new book coming out.
Okay, thank you. Same to you, Terry.
All right. Bye-bye.